Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to see a masterpiece of mystery that has baffled even the experts. Try and match your wits against theirs. Watch every move. Listen to every word. Can you guess the identity of Jack the Ripper?
Welcome to episode 27 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the horrors of Victorian London and Jack the Ripper, with two films that use the legend of the famous killer to explore themes of conspiracy, class, and the patriarchy. First up is Murder by Decree from 1979 and director Bob Clark, starring Christopher Plummer, James Mason, David Hemmings and Donald Sutherland. Then we travel back to 1971 for Hands of the Ripper from Hammer Studios, directed by Peter Sasdy and starring Eric Porter, Angharad Reese, Keith Bell and Dora Brian. Along the way we'll be discussing the history of Jack the Ripper movies from the 1920s onwards, the origins of the royal conspiracy theories surrounding the murders, the horror careers of directors Bob Clark and Peter Sasdy, and much, much more. Before we do that though, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing the history of Jack the Ripper films and Murder by Decree, I have referred to the books Euro Gothic and English Gothic, both by Jonathan Rigby, the book The House That Hammer Built, Volume 2 by Wayne Kinsey, an article by Remy Dean from the website framerated.co.uk, an incredibly well-researched blog post by Master Cylinder on Tumblr, and IMDb and Wikipedia pages for all of the movies and directors discussed. And when covering Hands of the Ripper, I have again referred to the Jonathan Rigby book English Gothic, as well as the book Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film by Peter Hutchings, as well as an award-winning interview with director Peter Sasdy, conducted by Ashley Thorpe, and that can be found in Fangoria magazine. And so, without any further ado, let's get into our first movie of the week, which is Murder by Decree. This was released in 1979 and directed by Bob Clark, and stars Christopher Plummer, James Mason, David Hemmings, and Donald Sutherland. I think it probably goes without saying that the murders committed in Whitechapel, London by the killer known as Jack the Ripper have long been the subject of fascination and debate. From the discovery of the first victim in 1888 right up to the present day, the story of the killings has been retold, embellished, and used as the basis for countless conspiracy theories, books, TV shows, and films. I am not a ripperologist or an expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm not going to spend too much time today discussing all of the possible suspects, but I am going to begin by looking at several of the film versions of the story, which will also incorporate some of the theories surrounding the murders. So, although we're not getting directly into the spoilers straight away, the discussion of some of these theories is going to ruin the plots of more than a few of the films that we're talking about. So, as always, please proceed with caution. The first film to reference the killer dates back to the silent era, and the earliest, as far as I can determine, is the 1924 German anthology film Waxworks. Directed by Paul Linay and starring the legendary Conrad Veidt, the film uses the framing device of a writer commissioned to create a series of stories about the exhibits in a wax museum. The figures include Haroun al-Rashid, played by Emil Jannings, Ivan the Terrible, played by Conrad Veidt, and of course Jack the Ripper, portrayed by Werner Krauss. Waxworks is the first horror film to use a wax museum as its setting and devotes its final section to a story about Jack the Ripper. This segment is actually the shortest of all three in the movie and runs at just 6 minutes, compared with the 40 minutes given to each of the preceding stories. The Jack the Ripper story is in fact generally regarded as being overshadowed by the central episode featuring Ivan the Terrible. Nevertheless, when the movie was released in the UK, the British censors were less than happy of a real-life murderer being used for entertainment, and they requested that the character's name be changed to the mythological character of Spring-Heeled Jack, on the grounds that this was probably more acceptable to public taste. You can only imagine what they would have made of Ryan Murphy. 3 years later, Alfred Hitchcock released The Lodger, a story of the London fog, starring Ivor Novello. This film was based on a novel titled The Lodger by Marie Belloc-Lowndes, which first appeared as a short story and was later serialised in the Daily Telegraph. This is generally regarded as the first full-length novel inspired by the murders, and she took her cue from a conversation overheard at a dinner party. One of the guests mentioned that their father's former maid and butler, who were now married and running a boarding house, had become convinced that the killer had spent a night under their roof before committing, quote, the most horrible of his murders, end quote. Belloc-Lowndes was struck by the story and developed it further, including references to another real-life murderer, Dr. Neil Cream, for good measure. The resulting book was a considerable success and inspired a wave of similar stories, many of them falling into the so-called penny dreadful category, but it also provided the basis for Alfred Hitchcock's third feature film. In the movie, a killer known as the Avenger is terrorising London, targeting blonde women on Tuesday evenings and prompting many blondes to hide their hair beneath dark hats or wigs. At the same time, a mysterious lodger, bearing a troubling resemblance to descriptions of the killer, arrives at a London boarding house and quickly falls under suspicion. A critical and commercial success on its release, The Lodger marks the first time that Hitchcock made a cameo appearance in one of his own films, and it also anticipates many of the themes that would define his later work: morally ambiguous protagonists, blonde heroines, and innocent people on the run for crimes that they possibly didn't commit. Although it was technically his third feature, Hitchcock himself would later describe it as the first true Hitchcock film, and multiple versions are available to watch on YouTube. Although this was the first adaptation of Belloc-Lowndes' novel, it would be followed by 4 further versions. The first of these was a 1932 remake, again called The Lodger and again starring Ivor Novello, but it was released in the US as The Phantom Fiend. By all accounts, it was not particularly successful, and this failure was referenced decades later by Dame Maggie Smith's character in Robert Altman's movie Gosford Park that was released in 2001. This was followed by a 1944 version starring Lade Krieger, Merle Oberon and George Sanders. There was also a 1953 adaptation titled The Man in the Attic that starred Jack Palance, and finally there was a 2009 version, once more titled The Lodger, but this time updated to present-day Los Angeles and starring Alfred Molina and Simon Baker. A similar story is explored in the 1949 British film Room to Let, which was produced by Exclusive Studios, the company that would soon evolve into Hammer Films. Based on a radio play by crime novelist Marjorie Allingham, who made just enough changes for the adaptation to be considered original, the resulting film is often described as Hammer's first foray into Gothic horror. Set in 1904, the story imagines that the Ripper has been confined to an insane asylum since the murders over a decade earlier. After a fire breaks out, a young journalist becomes convinced that the patient has escaped, and at the same time, a mysterious Dr. Fell takes lodgings in a nearby boarding house and begins to exert a very malign influence over the 3 women who live there. Despite the presence of the distinctly voiced Valentine Dial, the film was not a major commercial or critical success, and was described at the time by critics as effective but grim and, quote, well acted but occasionally tedious, end quote. A character based on the Ripper also appears in the 1929 silent classic Pandora's Box, starring the iconic, in the real sense of the word, silent film star Louise Brooks. Based on a pair of plays by the German writer Frank Wedekind, the film follows Lulu, a very free-spirited and uninhibited young woman who brings about the downfall of many of the men in her life, as well as eventually her own. At the end of the film, and yes, this is a major spoiler, she turns to sex work, and on Christmas Eve ends up meeting Jack the Ripper as her final client. He is immediately smitten with her, and initially tries to resist his homicidal impulses, even throwing away his knife. But his murderous instincts prove far too strong, and ultimately he stabs her to death at the end of the film. Heavily censored and banned in several countries, Pandora's Box was dismissed by critics on release and quickly faded into obscurity. And it was not until the 1950s that it was rediscovered and championed by a whole new generation. Now widely regarded as a masterpiece of German silent cinema, it has been restored and re-released multiple times. And although it has never been officially remade, the Wedekind plays on which it was based have inspired numerous adaptations of their own. In most of these films, then, the Ripper is very much an accessory or a plot device. But in 1959, the British company Mid-Century Film Productions released their movie Jack the Ripper, set in 1888 and based on a novel by a writer called Leonard Matters. Matters was a former Australian journalist who later moved to the UK and became a Labour Party politician. He published a magazine article in 1926 in which he claimed that the Ripper was an eminent doctor who carried out the killings as an act of revenge after his son died from syphilis that he'd contracted from a sex worker. Matters alleged that this doctor, who he called Dr. Stanley, fled to Argentina and then made a deathbed confession, a story that he said he uncovered while reading an Argentinian newspaper. He later expanded his theory into the first full-length book on the Ripper murders, called The Mystery of Jack the Ripper, that was published in 1929. Perhaps not surprisingly, this book and theory has been widely discredited and criticised for numerous factual errors, not least for the fact that none of the supposed supporting documents have ever been found. But this did not stop the book being used as the basis for the 1959 movie, and this film features a New York detective who visits his British inspector friend and agrees to help solve the Ripper murders. Featuring a scene at the climax where the black and white suddenly switches to colour to show off the blood, it was described by the New York Times as a shoddy horror feature that was extravagant only in its amount of gore. But by all accounts, it performed better than average at the UK box office and earned over $1 million on its US release. It's available on YouTube if you want to check it out, but do try to watch the US version, as the British censors objected to the switch to colour in the last moments, and so it's only the US print that includes this. In 1965, we would see the first attempt to pit the Ripper against the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, and this was with the release of A Study in Terror. Starring John Neville as Sherlock Holmes and Donald Houston as Dr. Watson, this is very much a whodunit, with a cast of suspects and a solution which suggests that the Ripper murders were conducted as a result of blackmail. It stars a slew of British character actors, including Barbara Windsor, Adrienne Corrie, and a very young Judi Dench, and it also stars Frank Finlay as Inspector Lestrade, a role that he would return to over a decade later with Murder by Decree. So far so interesting, and with not a trace of the royal family in sight. But all of that was about to change as we headed into the next decade. In 1970, the British crime magazine The Criminologist published an article called Jack the Ripper, A Solution, which was written by a British surgeon called Thomas E. A. Stowell. In this article, Stowell did not specifically name the Ripper, but did claim that he was an aristocrat who had contracted syphilis during a visit to the West Indies, and that the disease had driven him insane. And although he didn't name the suspect in the article, he did apparently describe in a fair amount of detail the suspect's family, his physical appearance, and his nickname, all of which seem to point to the grandson of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence. The article went on to say that following the double murder, committed on the 30th of September 1888, the suspect was restrained by his family and locked in a mental asylum, managing to escape to commit a final murder on the 9th of November before ultimately dying of his syphilitic disease. According to Stowell, all of the information came from the private records of Sir William Gull, an English doctor who had treated royalty and was in fact one of the doctors appointed to Queen Victoria. Unfortunately, despite the intense attention that the article attracted, there were many holes in the theory. Sir William Gull died before Albert Victor's death and could not have known how his life came to an end. All three doctors who attended the death of Albert Victor also concluded that he died of pneumonia, and it's also highly improbable that he ever had syphilis. We can presume this because the first symptoms of mental illness arising from the infection generally occur about 15 years from the first exposure, and so for Albert Victor to have suffered from syphilitic insanity in 1888, he would have needed to be infected at the age of about 9. Stowell also claimed that the suspect had been incarcerated in a mental asylum, but during this period, Albert Victor was in fact serving in the British Army and making regular public appearances, all of which were supported by newspaper articles, official documents, and family letters. At the beginning of November 1970, Stowell wrote a letter to the Times denying that he meant to imply that Prince Albert Victor was Jack the Ripper. Unfortunately, the retraction was published the day after Stowell's own death from natural causes, and so he never knew of its publication. Following his death, his son reported that Stowell had indeed maintained a folder on the Ripper murders, but that he had burned it himself after his father's death, saying, quote, "I read just sufficient to make sure there was nothing of importance." End quote. Needless to say, though, this article and the subsequent retraction did cause an increase of interest in the Ripper case, and Hammer Studios were able to capitalise on this with the release, a year later, of their 2 movies, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, and Hands of the Ripper, both of which we'll talk about shortly. Although Stowell's article was flawed, to say the least, the renewed interest also inspired the BBC to produce a 6-part docudrama series titled Jack the Ripper, which was released in 1973. Written by John Hopkins and Elwyn Jones, both of whom had previously worked on the British TV police show Z-Cars, the series featured 2 detectives from the Z-Cars series retrospectively investigating the Ripper murders. The idea was that they would use present-day police methods to try to uncover the killer's identity, and in episode 6, the show presented the video testimony of a man called Joseph Gorman. Gorman also called himself Joseph Sickert and claimed to be the son of the artist Walter Sickert. He also claimed to be the grandson of a secret union between Prince Albert Victor and Annie Crook, a working-class Catholic who was also an artist model. According to Gorman, Prince Albert Victor, also known as quote-unquote Eddie, fell in love with and married Annie Crook, and the 2 of them had a child. The royal establishment were terrified of scandal, and also the horror of having a Catholic announced as the heir to the throne. So, as a result, they had Annie Crook institutionalised and her mind destroyed by the royal physician Sir William Gull. Unfortunately, they were too late. The child was hidden away, and a group of East End sex workers who knew all about the baby tried to blackmail the royal family. Sir William Gull, assisted by a royal coachman called John Netley, and protected by a conspiracy of Freemasons, then systematically murdered all of the women to gain their silence and to try to find the location of the secret baby. This is, of course, essentially the same plot as Murder by Decree, as well as the basic premise of Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's graphic novel From Hell, the 1988 Michael Caine miniseries titled Jack the Ripper, and the 2001 film adaptation of From Hell, starring Johnny Depp and a woefully miscast Heather Graham. But, as it turns out, Gorman made the entire thing up, something that he later admitted himself. In a 1978 interview with the Sunday Times, he said, quote, "It was a hoax, I made it all up," end quote, and that the story was a quote-unquote whopping fib. It should be said that the BBC drama neither confirms nor denies Gorman's story. It is simply presented and viewed with more than a little scepticism. It was, however, repeated in a novelisation of the series titled The Ripper File, which was published in 1975. Had it ended there, we might well have seen the last of it. Unfortunately, the story also caught the attention of a writer named Stephen Knight, and in 1976 he published Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. Even though Knight's book was met with undisguised scepticism and satire, the 1970s was, as we've discussed more than a few times, a decade steeped in paranoia and suspicion, and one in which conspiracy theories really began to take hold. The supposed royal plot, the Freemasons, the illegitimate royal baby, it was in many ways the Da Vinci Code of its day, and probably just as badly written. So, regardless of its many plot holes and inaccuracies, the story really captured the public imagination, and Jack the Ripper became a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Even British Light Entertainment got in on the act. On their Saturday evening sketch show, comedy duo The Two Ronnies performed a parody of Ripper mythology and hammer horror that was called the Phantom Raspberry Blower of Old London Town, and I have to admit, it absolutely terrified me when I was a kid. Meanwhile, in the US, 1978 saw Leonard Nimoy host a special In Search Of episode that was devoted to Jack the Ripper, bringing the legend to a whole new audience. The time then was clearly right for a brand new Jack the Ripper movie. And so enter director Bob Clark. Bob Clark was born Benjamin Robert Clark on the 5th of August 1939 in New Orleans. His father died when he was very young and his mother was a barmaid, so it's probably fair to say that his early life was marked by financial struggles. His family moved quite frequently when he was young, and he grew up first in Birmingham, Alabama, and then moved to Fort Lauderdale in Florida. A very talented football player, he won a football scholarship to college in Michigan, and by all accounts received many offers to play professionally, but instead chose to study drama at the University of Miami. In 1966, he wrote and directed his first movie, a short that was called The Emperor's New Clothes, which starred John Carradine and was based on the fairy story by Hans Christian Andersen. He followed this in 1968 with the not-so-subtly titled She-Man, which is a 1-hour black and white film about cross-dressing that's been described as, quote, hilariously bad in all respects, end quote. It wouldn't be until 5 years later that he would begin to make a mark on the horror genre with the release of Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. Co-written with Alan Ormsby, who also plays the main human antagonist, this is a cult comedy horror that follows a sadistic theatre director who forces his acting troupe to take part in a ritual to raise the dead. Although I have to say it's not one of my favourites, it does have a fairly dedicated following, and there are numerous versions of it available on YouTube if you want to check it out. In the same year, Clark and Ormsby released another, far more successful Living Dead movie with Death Dream, which was also released in some regions as Dead of Night. This is very loosely based on the classic story The Monkey's Paw, and features a young American soldier who returns home after apparently being killed during the Vietnam War. As the film progresses, we discover that he is in fact one of the undead, and across the course of the narrative he deteriorates physically and psychologically, descending into violence and murder. Much like its source material, it plays on the adage of being careful what you wish for, as well as acting as an allegory for Vietnam, with a young All-American sent off to war and literally returning as a monster. But it would be in 1974 that Clark would release the film for which he is best known, by horror fans at least, and this is the proto-slasher Black Christmas, starring Olivia Hussey, Margot Kidder and Keir Dullea. Shot in Toronto for a budget of $700,000, it was released to rather scathing reviews, but has gone on to gain a cult following, as well as being recognised as a significant influence on the slasher genre. Genuinely creepy, and more than a little inspired by a very famous urban legend, if you haven't seen it yet, I have no doubt at all that it will be shown on TV at some point over the festive season, and it's definitely worth checking out. It also went on to inspire 2 remakes, neither of which I have seen, but which by all accounts aren't particularly good, so I suspect it may be a case of sticking with the original. In the same year, he would produce, albeit uncredited, the Alan Ormsby co-directed feature Deranged, loosely based on serial killer Ed Gein. And a year later, he also produced an action comedy movie called Moonrunners, which would go on to inspire the TV series The Dukes of Hazzard. He returned to directing in 1976 with a crime drama called Breaking Point, about a family man who has to go into witness protection, before beginning work on the first of this week's movies, Murder by Decree. Before we go any further, I am sure that there are some people who will say that my inclusion of this movie in the series is tenuous at best and that Murder by Decree is not a horror, but I would respectfully suggest otherwise. Yes, admittedly, it is first and foremost a Sherlock Holmes vehicle, but with its slow-motion carriages, first-person POV shots, and, dare I say it, musically seemingly influenced by the Jaws soundtrack, it certainly betrays Clarke's horror origins, if nothing else. And, in my opinion, by the time we get to the wince-inducing torture porn murder of Mary Kelly, shown only through a filthy window, and the rather grisly end of the Ripper himself, we are firmly in horror territory. It may not actually be a slasher movie, but it's certainly slasher adjacent. Originally titled Sherlock Holmes and Saucy Jack, thank God they changed it, the film was initially inspired by the Stephen Knight book. However, by all accounts, Clarke was less than impressed by some of the book's content, and instead decided to turn to the book The Ripper File, which, as we mentioned earlier, was the novelisation of the BBC 1973 drama documentary. According to Clarke, he never intended to make a film that proved any historical theories. In fact, he wasn't trying to prove anything at all. His intent was to create a speculative what-if alternative history, and this was why he brought Sherlock Holmes into the story. By including him, Clarke said, the film implicitly signals that it is not claiming to depict fact. And it should be noted here that, unlike other films that are based on the same conspiracy theory, Clarke and his co-writer John Hopkins at least have the decency to change the names of the characters in order to protect the innocent. William Gull, who had nothing at all to do with the murders, is called Thomas Spivey, while the coachman John Netley is renamed William Slade. Sherlock Holmes has been immortalised on film countless times, more recently by Robert Downey Jr. in the Guy Ritchie action series, and also the modernised TV retellings Sherlock, starring Benedict Cumberbatch, and Elementary, starring Johnny Lee Miller. The most faithful adaptation is widely thought to be the ITV drama series starring Jeremy Brett that ran from 1984 to 1994, though some would argue that Peter Cushing's TV series, produced in the mid-1960s, is also a very strong contender. Personally though, and with huge apologies to fans of Conan Doyle's writing, I have to say that my favourites are the 20th Century Fox and Universal series starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. Beginning with The Hound of the Baskervilles, this was a run of 14 films released between 1939 and 1946, and very much flirted with both horror and the uncanny. Stories include the great Rondo Hatton as the Hoxton Creeper in The Pearl of Death, a glow-in-the-dark monster on the marshes in The Scarlet Claw, and of course the titular hound that terrorises Sir Henry Baskerville in the first of the series. As you may have gathered from that brief description, these films are not particularly loyal to the original source material, and many were in fact completely original stories, so I'm sure there is much there to offend any Sherlock Holmes purists. That being said, I'm really not one, and my personal favourite is The Woman in Green, which was released in 1945. This story features hypnosis, blackmail, mass murder, and the best incarnation of Professor Moriarty ever put to film, in the shape of British actor Henry Daniell. It's also probably worth pointing out that the 1939 version of The Hound of the Baskervilles is the very first time that Holmes's alleged drug addiction is mentioned on screen, with Basil Rathbone issuing the immortal line, "Watson, the needle," shortly before the end credits roll. Many of these films have slipped into the public domain and can be found on YouTube, though you may want to avoid the colorized versions, which I hope goes without saying. I also think it's fair to say that some of them have dated rather poorly in some respects. So just be advised that they don't all necessarily hold up to modern sensibilities. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the very unfortunate use of brownface in the otherwise excellent Sherlock Holmes and the Spider Woman, which features Gail Sondergaard as the titular villainess. And something else that may not sit too well with a modern audience is the depiction of Dr. Watson as a bumbling idiot, something which seems to increase exponentially as the series progresses. This is in no way a criticism of Nigel Bruce, who simply played the scripts that he was given, but I think it's fair to say that many will find the comedic nature of the character more than a little irritating. Fortunately, Bob Clark and co-writer Hopkins decided to take a very different approach with the characters of both Holmes and Watson, moving away from the seemingly superhuman Holmes and the bumbling sidekick. The idea was to reinvent the dynamic by making them both far more human and stressing that their friendship is a partnership of equals and of mutual respect. Clark explained that he wanted to humanise both men and to portray a passionate and caring Holmes, breaking through the character's traditional reserve that had been depicted in most earlier adaptations. Although he claimed to admire the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce movies, he very much disliked the way that Holmes was patronising to Watson rather than appreciating him as fully as he should. From the outset, he said, his goal was to depict two men who have a real friendship between them. That being said though, Murder by Decree is certainly not without its own jarring comedic moments, including a rather unnecessary bit of business regarding a squash pea, and a weighted scarf slapstick sequence that, to be honest, I could quite do without. Like many of the movies we've discussed in the series, the lead actors were not the first choice, with Peter O'Toole and Laurence Olivier originally in the frame, but I think the casting of Plummer and Mason is pretty perfect. Plummer had already played Sherlock Holmes in a 1977 TV movie titled Silver Blaze, and here he brings a real humanity to the role, suffering both physical and psychological injury. Not only that, but here Holmes is far from infallible, by his own admission leading the murderers directly to Mary Kelly and becoming directly implicated in her brutal death. Some critics have suggested that the performance is too emotional, preserving the reserve of Jeremy Brett, but I think that the depiction here is rather effective. According to Clark, the intention with Plummer was to create, quote, a very warm and vital Holmes, a man who cares very passionately, end quote. And this is something that is made quite clear when he is reduced to tears at the horrors inflicted on Annie Crook. The same is true of James Mason's depiction of Watson, who approached the character as, quote, an intelligent friend of Holmes, pointing out that the character was meant to be a qualified medical doctor and that Holmes would never have shared his life with an idiot. Watson, in this film, is a shrewd and intelligent companion, very much a man of science, and rolling his eyes at the mention of psychic phenomena. He also proves himself to be rather handy in a fight, easily taking care of the pimp who tries to con him out of cash halfway through the film. We open with a panoramic shot of London at sunset, albeit quite clearly a model, the tranquility of which is disrupted by the whistle of a policeman, suggesting that despite the calm appearance, crime and violence are never far away. We cut from this to the foggy streets of London, a rather stereotypical image that seems more than a little inspired by the world of Hammer horror, but which is nevertheless a very impressive piece of set design. At the time, this was one of the largest sets ever built in the UK, and took 100 men over 8 weeks to construct at Elstree Studios. There's also a considerable amount of attention to detail from the designer Harry Pottle, which includes 4,000 square feet of cobblestones that were strewn with stale fruit, straw and vegetables, blended with Fuller's earth to represent manure. And here, after we cut through the various shots of the foggy streets, we have the first nod to Clark's horror background. This is the appearance of a horse-drawn carriage, labouring towards the camera and distorted through a fisheye lens, courtesy of cinematographer Reginald H. Morris. This rather nightmarish image is accompanied by a soundtrack from composers Paul Zaza and Carl Zitra, which was performed by the London Philharmonic Orchestra. In a later interview, Zaza described the scoring process as the biggest thing he had ever done. saying, quote, "I was a kid in my 20s, standing there and conducting the Royal Philharmonic. I had big producers from New York in there and Bob Clark. There were 90 musicians and the pressure was on. But I put the baton down and we conducted the first cue. And it was absolutely glorious. It was just beautiful." We cut from the foggy and nightmarish back streets to the Royal Opera House, a transition that introduces one of the key themes of the movie, that of class conflict. Here we first see Holmes and Watson, but importantly, we are also introduced to the royal family with the arrival of the prince, greeted by jeers and boos from a section of the audience. We later learn that this section of the audience are in fact a group of radicals calling themselves the Citizens Committee, a movement determined to bring down the privileged regardless of the cost. This group attempts to employ Holmes to investigate the killings, saying that if the murders had taken place in the wealthier areas of London, the police would have caught the Ripper. And even though they highlight that the victims are poor women forced onto the streets, we soon establish that their interest has less to do with saving the women of Whitechapel and far more to do with political discontent. This is something that is made very clear towards the end of the movie by their leader Foxborough, played by David Hemmings, who says that the victims are, in and of themselves, not important. They are merely evidence of the government's contempt for the working class. And it is this narrative, running throughout the picture, that I feel justifies the more emotional depiction of Holmes. Of all of the men in the movie, from the police to the government to the Citizens Committee, he is the only one who actually cares about the fate of the women, not as a symbol, but as human beings. As well as the Citizens Committee, we also have references to the Bloody Sunday protest of 1887, in which the police clashed violently with demonstrators in Trafalgar Square. These began when protesters marched on Trafalgar Square to demonstrate against unemployment in Britain and the suppression of the Irish. However, police, supported by the army, were waiting for them, and a very violent clash followed, resulting in many injuries on both sides, with 2 demonstrators dying. This event highlighted both social unrest and also police brutality, and it contributed greatly to negative perception of the police, something that would be built upon when the Jack the Ripper murders began the following year. And this is something that is expressed quite clearly in the dialogue in the film, when the character of Sir Charles is explicitly blamed for the violence, with the line, quote, "He's every bit as responsible as the radicals," end quote. As well as David Hemmings, the cast consists of many great British actors of the time. Frank Finlay reprises his role as Lestrade from A Study in Terror, though sadly here is given much less to do. Anthony Quayle, who also appeared in A Study in Terror as Dr. Murray, also appears, this time as the corrupt Sir Charles Warren. Strangely enough though, despite this coincidental casting, Clarke says he had no knowledge at all of the previous Holmes and Ripper movie, and only found out after Frank Finlay had been cast. Joining them are Canadian actors Genevieve Bujold as Annie Crook, Susan Clarke as Mary Kelly, and Donald Sutherland as Robert Lees, another real-life character whose role in the Ripper legend has again been exaggerated over time. Lees was a spiritualist medium who was living in London at the time of the murders, and in his diary from 1888, he records that he went to the City of London Police and Scotland Yard to offer his clairvoyant help, but on both occasions he was dismissed as a lunatic and sent on his way. And that's really about the extent of it. The story that we see in Murder by Decree, as well as several of the other Jack the Ripper dramas that would follow, actually originates from a publication in the Chicago Herald in 1895, and this article was also reprinted in the British newspaper The People a month later. This story, which again has been widely proven to be fabricated, suggests that Lees had repeated visions, managed to recognise the Ripper on a bus, stalked him through London, and personally led the police to the home of a titled doctor. However, factual or not, without this story we wouldn't get Sutherland's performance, which is magnificently creepy by anyone's standards. I suspect this probably has more to do with the way that he is filmed than anything else, and also the fact that his narrative is intercut with more nightmarish imagery of the streets of Whitechapel. This includes a close-up of the jet black eyes of the Ripper and a slow-motion sequence of a body being thrown from a carriage directly towards the camera, again filmed through a slightly distorting lens. As well as the imagery and score, there is also a highly effective use of editing by Stanley Cole, who had also edited Black Christmas. The most notable example of this comes during the moment when Holmes finally meets Mary Kelly, a scene that is intercut with the carriage racing through the streets towards them, the sound of the wheels and the horses' hooves on the cobbles amplified while a church bell rings in the background. The same technique is used during Mary Kelly's murder, her horrific screams and moans intercut with Holmes and Watson running frantically through the alleys of Whitechapel to try unsuccessfully to save her. When Holmes finally breaks into her room, the camera zooms in first on the bloody killers and then on Holmes's face, creating a physical feeling of shock in the viewer as the horror of the crime is revealed. And although by this time Clarke had said that he was tired of horror, he did acknowledge the debt that the editing of this movie owes to his origins, saying, quote, "I'm glad I did horror films. They're the greatest training in the world. Making horror films requires a great deal of editing discipline and attention to rhythm. I think some of my early films are my best work. I've no regrets." End quote. The world premiere of Murder by Decree was held in Toronto on the 1st of February 1979, after which it was distributed in North America through Avco Embassy. Although the performances, particularly James Mason, were called out for praise, reviews at the time were rather mixed. And while Variety called it probably the best Sherlock Holmes film since Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce, others felt that the pacing was too slow and the plot too convoluted. In Canada, however, the film was widely celebrated and was nominated for 8 Genie Awards, going on to win 5. These included Best Achievement in Direction, Best Performance by an Actor in a Leading Role, Best Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role, and Outstanding Musical Score. Unfortunately, though, despite becoming the 4th highest grossing film ever in Canada, at the time anyway, it managed to recoup about only half of its budget, and people have suggested that this was due to its rather dark tone and its strange hybrid mix of horror and drama, which caused challenges in terms of marketing. When asked for his opinion about this in a later interview, Bob Clarke was somewhat philosophical, saying, quote, "I don't know. To tell the truth, I don't really think that much about it. It's a great film. I quite rightly regard it as my best work, and my biggest triumph so far." End quote. Murder by Decree would be the last horror or horror-adjacent movie that Bob Clarke would direct, and signalled a shift away from exploitation more towards the mainstream. He followed this with Tribute in 1980, a drama that starred Jack Lemmon and which would receive significant critical praise, and also earn Jack Lemmon an Oscar nomination. Perhaps his biggest financial success, though, was in 1981 with the movie Porky's, an incredibly dated sex comedy that would have an extended lifespan during the age of home video. Despite the fact that many critics called it one of the worst films of the year and criticised it for the objectification of its female characters, it ended up becoming one of the highest grossing Canadian films of all time, with revenue exceeding $160 million worldwide. He followed this with a complete 180, directing the family favourite A Christmas Story in 1983, before going on to direct a series of much less successful films. These include the Sylvester Stallone and Dolly Parton musical, Yes Really, titled Rhinestone in 1984, and Super Babies, Baby Geniuses 2 in 2004, both of which led him to be nominated twice for the Razzie Awards as Worst Director. Incredibly tragically, on April the 4th, 2007, Bob Clarke and his younger son Ariel, who was aged just 22 at the time, lost their lives in a head-on car crash on the Pacific Coast Highway in Los Angeles. At the time of his death, he was reportedly working with Howard Stern on a remake of Porky's, and having seen the first remake of Black Christmas, was reportedly also involved in pre-production for remakes of Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things and also Death Dream. He left behind a legacy of over 30 movies, and despite the fact that he pivoted away from horror completely after Murder by Decree, there can be no doubt that with his earlier efforts, and most certainly Black Christmas, he also earned himself a rightful place in the pantheon of influential horror directors. All of which brings us on to our second movie of the week, which is Hands of the Ripper from 1971 and Hammer Studios, directed by Peter Sasdy and starring Eric Porter, Angharad Reese, Keith Bell and Dora Brian. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Hammer Studios, who had once dominated the horror market, were very much beginning to struggle. The studio's trademark Gothic sensibilities and period-bound dramas were falling rapidly out of favour, particularly with the growing youth market. In the States, films like Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, and Rosemary's Baby were bringing horror firmly into the 20th century, while the rise of exploitation cinema and international offerings from Europe were pushing the envelope even further in terms of sex and violence. Against this new wave of contemporary horror, Hammer was beginning to look decidedly old-fashioned and, dare I say it, even cosy. As we discussed back in episode 6, even a film like 1968's The Devil Rides Out, which I personally consider to be their greatest movie, struggled to make much of an impact at the box office. Following the success of Psycho in 1960, Hammer had already attempted to diversify with a run of psychological thrillers, beginning with A Taste of Fear in 1961 and continuing through to Paranoiac in 1963, starring a young Oliver Reed, and Crescendo in 1970, to name just a few. Some of these were admittedly far better than others, but as the decade wore on, it became clear that audiences were looking for a very different kind of horror. In an attempt to keep up with demand, the studio pivoted towards more explicit fare, largely featuring female nudity and titillation. In 1970, they released The Vampire Lovers, the first movie in their Karnstein trilogy. This was very loosely based on Sheridan Le Fanu's vampire novella Carmela and showcased lesbian sex as well as vampirism. Whilst it was definitely a step in a different direction and features a remarkable performance by Ingrid Pitt, it was pretty dated even by the time of its release. And this is something that comes sharply into focus when you compare it with the movie Count Yorga Vampire, which was released in the US in the same year. And as if in response to Yorga, in 1972, Hammer attempted to bring Dracula himself kicking and screaming into the 20th century with the release of Dracula AD 1972. This was a pretty instantly dated misstep that, despite the presence of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, is widely regarded as one of their weakest ventures, at least until the Satanic Rites of Dracula came along a year later. This then was a studio that was very much in decline, and as we now all know, it wouldn't survive to see out the decade. For many, this is understandably seen as the low point in Hammer's history, a time when it was chasing trends instead of setting them. But this doesn't mean that they weren't still producing interesting works, particularly in terms of the themes that they were exploring. In 1970, they released Taste the Blood of Dracula, a film that has quite a lot to say about hypocrisy and the patriarchy. And this would be a theme that they would return to in several of their movies, most notably Twins of Evil in 1971, Demons of the Mind in 1972, and our second movie this week, Hands of the Ripper, in which a very misguided father figure exploits a young girl for his own rather dubious purposes. Although the screenplay actually predated the renewed wave of interest in the Ripper sparked by the Criminologist article, its release in 1971 could not have been better timed. Nor was it the only Hammer film of that year to play with the Ripper mythology. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, starring Ralph Bates and Martine Bezic, also folds the Whitechapel murders into its storyline, this time making them unequivocally the work of the scientist and his deadly ego. It even manages to throw the grave robbers Burke and Hare into the mix for good measure. But whereas Sister Hyde is rather campy good fun, Hands of the Ripper is a far more serious affair, linking Freudian psychology to lurid murders and genuine tragedy. The film was directed by Peter Sasdy, who had made his Hammer feature debut with Taste the Blood of Dracula just 1 year before. Born in Budapest in 1935, he grew up through the Second World War and left Hungary shortly after the failure of the 1956 anti-communist uprising. Arriving in the UK, he studied drama and journalism at the University of Bristol, and then in 1958 joined Associated Television, otherwise known as ATV, and began his career directing multiple episodes of the first British soap opera, Emergency Ward 10. From here, he became ATV's Director of Drama, which is quite a big achievement for a young director, but ultimately decided to go freelance in 1964, working across a wide range of TV series. This work included an episode of the 1965 Peter Cushing Sherlock Holmes series, and also led him to his first work for Hammer, directing an episode of their anthology series, Journey to the Unknown. His success in television brought him to the attention of Hammer producer Ada Young, who facilitated an introduction to Sir James Carreras, one of the co-founders of the studios, and who offered him his feature debut on Taste the Blood of Dracula. This movie was Hammer's fifth instalment in their Dracula series, and was their first attempt to bring the Count into more modern times, or the Victorian era at any rate. The story tells of a group of bored, middle-aged and middle-class men who once a month pretend to be helping the poor and needy, but who in reality are spending their evenings visiting brothels, something with which they are also gradually losing interest. On one of these nights out, they meet the morally corrupt Lord Courtly, who is quite clearly based on Lord Byron, and who promises them an experience that they are never going to forget. Leading them to an abandoned church, he attempts to perform a black mass and to raise his master, Count Dracula, but the men, repulsed by what he is trying to do, attack him and beat him to death. Unfortunately for them, though, the ritual has in fact worked, and Dracula is indeed resurrected. He spends the rest of the movie seeking revenge for the murder of his servant by vampirizing their children and turning them into killing machines. Starring a very reluctant Christopher Lee, who had by now tried several times to leave the series, it is far from being the greatest Dracula movie in the world. But the notion of children being turned against their hypocritical parents is a very interesting one, and very well executed, particularly by the actress Linda Hayden, here making her horror film debut. On the basis of this movie, Sasdy began to be taken seriously as a rising star at Hammer, and when he approached them with an idea for a movie based on the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, they were all ears. Sir James read Sasdy's one-page treatment for the movie and requested that he have a poster created to show his financial backers. According to Sasdy, he asked Hammer's graphics department to create a poster with lots of cleavage, lots of blood, and the title Countess Dracula. The backers clearly liked the poster, and Sasdy was given 6 weeks to prepare a screenplay and go into pre-production before filming began at Pinewood Studios. Another film that depicted a crumbling patriarchal society, quite literally preying on the young, Countess Dracula starred Ingrid Pitt in the title role, though it was not an experience that she would recall happily, and this was mainly due to Sasdy's decision to have her dialogue redubbed by a different actress in post-production. By her own account, Ingrid Pitt had put particular effort into getting Bathory's Hungarian accent absolutely correct, and so the decision to redub her with a, quote, cut-class English accent, end quote, left her, as she put it, post-apocalyptic. Regardless, Sasdy's direction pleased the head of Hammer, and following this, he was offered the chance to direct Hands of the Ripper, from a screenplay by Lou Davison, and based on an original story by a criminologist called Edward Spencer Shue. And here we are now getting into the spoilers, although, to be fair, Hands of the Ripper is a pretty straightforward narrative and there's not a huge amount to spoil. I'm not going to tell you the ending, but if you have yet to see the movie, as always, please be aware that I am going to discuss quite a few aspects of the story. The movie opens with a classic image of a torch-wielding mob running through the streets of London in hot pursuit of a stereotypical Jack the Ripper. He's got a cloak, he has a top hat, and a Gladstone doctor's bag. Avoiding the mob, he manages to make it home, where his wife, noticing the blood all over his hands, realises that he is in fact the notorious killer, and rather stupidly accuses him directly to his face. This results in him stabbing her to death and letting her die in front of the fire, and all of this is carried out in front of his young daughter Anna. Anna is watching events through the metal bars of her crib, the light of the fire bouncing off them in a way that will become far more important later. Lifting his daughter out of her crib, he kisses her on the cheek and then returns her to bed, leaving her to watch her mother die as he flees into the night. This sequence, the light of the fire dancing across her eyes and a kiss of affection, sets up a psychological trigger, one that, when repeated in the right order, causes the adult Anna to emulate her father's actions and murder the nearest person. This brings her into contact with Dr. John Pritchard, who wishes to study her behaviour and to unlock the secrets of her murderous mind, leading him to invite her into his household. Yes, he really is that stupid. Hans of the Ripper has frequently been compared with the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, which was famously adapted into the musical My Fair Lady, and more than one commentator has suggested that this is pretty much the same story, albeit with rather more blood and murder. Pritchard is played by Eric Porter, who made his name in the BBC drama series The Forsyte Saga, for which he won a BAFTA in 1967. Incidentally, and interestingly enough, given the theme of this week's episode, he would later go on to play Professor Moriarty opposite Jeremy Brett in the ITV adaptation of Sherlock Holmes. His portrayal of Pritchard is one of great depth, depicting a man caught up in his own ego and hubris, and who clearly has more than a little contempt for the members of his own household, including his son and his prospective daughter-in-law. And much as he might pretend to be only interested in Anna for scientific reasons, as the film progresses, his motivations become increasingly murky. From the moment that he brings her into his home, there is clearly a sexual motivation. She is moved into his dead wife's bedroom and even dressed in his dead wife's clothes. When he tells her, quote, "All you have to do is learn to become one of the family," it's hard to believe that he is imagining her in the role of a daughter. This is very much underlined when he walks in on her when she is in the bath, and instead of backing away or encouraging her to cover up, seems to relish in her discomfort, brushing it off because he is a man of science. And this in itself is rather laughable, as it turns out Pritchard is hardly an expert in psychoanalysis. When the blind Laura returns from just a year's absence, Pritchard's son Michael tells her that, quote, "Things have changed. Father's now become a follower of this man Freud and calls himself a psychoanalyst." End quote. Pritchard then really is little more than a rank amateur, and given that he invites a murderer into his house, this is perhaps not too much of a surprise. He even goes on to say that whilst it would be unlikely she will kill again whilst in his care, quote, "Even if she did, to understand the psychology of murder would be worth the risk." End quote. And in addition, in his book English Gothic, Jonathan Rigby makes the excellent point that the only real insight Pritchard gains into Anna's childhood comes via a medium, somebody that, as a man of science, he is supposed to despise. Pritchard is in fact one in a fairly long line of dubious father figures that have populated Hammer movies, beginning, of course, with Baron Frankenstein, and then continuing with Andrew Keir in 1971's Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, and Robert Hardy in Demons of the Mind in 1972. Bleaker, and rather more interesting than simple good versus evil narratives, these movies lean heavily into the notion of inherited trauma, with the relationships between children and supposed father figures pushing the narratives into Freudian territory. And in fact, in Hans of the Ripper, there are two monstrous father figures: Anna's biological father, who is a mass-murdering psychopath, and her stand-in father figure, Pritchard, who is willing to exploit her simply to prove his scientific research. And if that wasn't bad enough, he not only covers up her crimes, but he practically facilitates them, using hypnosis to identify her subconscious triggers and then letting her, still in a trance, roam the streets of London or stab him in the side with a sword. Anna is played by Angharad Reese, who strikes a sharp contrast to the more usual Hammer actresses of the period like Ingrid Pitt, Kate O'Mara or Valerie Leon. Seemingly fragile, her switch from wide-eyed innocent to craze killer is startling, and allows Sasdy and his director of photography Kenneth Talbot to include some quite striking visual juxtapositions. Most notably, we have the scene after Dolly's murder, where Anna stands at the top of the stairs, her pale pink dress splattered with blood, an image that highlights the duality of her character. And this is further emphasised by the duality of the score by Christopher Gunning, which switches from shrill terror to a melancholy flute motif representing innocence and childhood. For Reese, the character of Anna was a tragic figure, saying in a 1971 interview, quote, "I saw Anna as a straight, innocent girl who is totally normal to all outward appearances and to herself. And that was what made her all the more horribly sad to me." And sadly for Anna, it is not just Pritchard that seeks to exploit her. Pretty much every character in the movie wants to use her for personal gain. When we first meet her as an adult, although to be fair she is more of a teenager, she is working for a fake medium, played brilliantly by Dora Brian, who not only uses her as the voice of the spirits, but also pushes her into sex work, selling her body to the sleazy politician Dicehart on the proviso that she is a virgin. Later, when she is dazed and hypnotised walking through the streets, she is met by an older sex worker who again looks to exploit the girl's innocence and who is met by several hatpins through the eyes for her troubles. In fact, the only people to show her any kindness are met with violence. The maid Dolly is stabbed in the neck with a broken mirror, the medium, Madame Boulard, is stabbed through the heart, and even Mrs. Golding, saving her charge from the attentions of Dysart, is stabbed through the door with a poker. True to the shifting nature of audience expectations at the time, the murders are all extremely violent, or at least for the period anyway. And this is something that came in for more than a little criticism on the film's release. Films and Filming magazine thought that the brutality was unnecessary and suggested that the murders not only appeared with the regularity of a commercial break, but also threw the entire film off balance. In an interview with Fangoria magazine, Sasdy explained his approach to the violence, saying, quote, "The hatpin scene, which went on a bit, was very graphic, because I got a bit stubborn about that. But at the same time, I had to give a little. I don't believe that the violent bits were more shocking so much as, without sounding too pleased with myself, a little more original than the usual Dracula effects. I mean, if you analyse it, without going into too many details, if you take the Dora Brian character with the door slightly swinging, it's a surprise, it's original. I hadn't seen it before." End quote. And as it turns out, many people nearly didn't get to see it at all. In the UK, the British censor cut the hatpin sequence rather extensively, and in Australia, the film was initially banned for excessive violence and was only released after 2 minutes of the film were removed altogether. The fact that Anna's victims are mostly women is not just a convention of horror, but also a reference to the film's sexual politics. And this is something that is very much underlined by the graffiti calling for votes for women that appears in one of the earlier scenes of the film. Much as I said in Murder by Decree, in this world women are seen as disposable and unimportant figures whose murders are easily forgotten or even overlooked. When the maid Dolly is murdered, Pritchard covers it with a lie about her having to leave due to her mother being sick, and this excuse is met with the response, quote, "I didn't know she had one," end quote. Hands of the Ripper was released in the UK in October 1971 and in the US in July 1972, where it was paired with the third of Hammer's Karnstein trilogy, Twins of Evil, another film that features a monstrous father figure in the shape of Peter Cushing. On its UK release, the Monthly Film Bulletin called it, quote, "a disappointingly routine Hammer offering, with the usual virtues of good performances and period authenticity, but all the faults as well. A weakly developed plot, rhubarbing extras, and a basic appeal to sadism rather than imagination," end quote. The Independent Film Journal, on the other hand, was much kinder, calling it, quote, "an atmospheric feast for Victorian horror lovers, and believe it or not, it makes for one of the better Hammer films in quite some time," end quote. Meanwhile, in the US, Variety praised Hammer for breaking away from, quote, "its vampires and monster formula, and giving a highly intriguing twist to the Jack the Ripper murders," Well directed by Peter Sasdy, the tension is skillfully developed. Murders are particularly gruesome, and there are shocks that will have the most hardened filmgoer sitting up. Over time, it's probably fair to say that it's still not exactly seen as a classic of Hammer's back catalogue, coming as it does in the early 1970s, a period which is generally dismissed by many as the studio being in steep decline. I have to say though, out of the films that were released during this time frame, it's probably one of the more interesting ones, and certainly, in my opinion, is preferable to The Vampire Lovers or Lust for a Vampire, though having said that, that is a fairly low bar. Following the release of the film, Sasdy continued to work in horror, including the movie Doomwatch that was released in 1972 by Tygon Productions, and perhaps more impressively, the BBC scientific ghost story The Stone Tape, created by the legendary writer Nigel Kneale, and also released in 1972. Less notably, but interesting nonetheless, he also directed the occult police procedural Nothing But the Night in 1973, which was the one and only film released by Christopher Lee's Charlemagne Productions. And then in 1975, he directed Ralph Bates, Joan Collins and Eileen Atkins in the demonic baby movie I Don't Want to Be Born. This was, of course, very much inspired by Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and is also known as Sharon's Baby, also known as The Monster, and also known as an absolutely appalling film. I have to say I like a bad movie as much as the next person, but this one has absolutely nothing to recommend it, even with Joan Collins. Outside of horror, he also directed a 1983 movie called The Lonely Lady, starring Pia Zadora, for which he won a Razzie Award for Worst Director, and which by all accounts completely put paid to his theatrical directing career. Interestingly enough though, that film also marked the screen debut of Ray Liotta, so I guess we all have to start somewhere. Outside of feature films, he continued his directing career largely in television, including episodes of the TV programmes Return of the Saint and Minder, and more importantly for our purposes, he was also responsible for 3 episodes of the Hammer House of Horror TV series, a show that I've managed to not mention for at least 8 weeks. He also contributed to the less successful follow-up, The Hammer House of Mystery and Suspense, and in 1992 directed a BBC miniseries called Witchcraft. I have to say this has completely passed me by, but by all accounts it is a meta-occult drama about a film production crew making a movie about a witch that starts to bleed into real life. And if anyone has seen it and thinks it's worth a watch, please do let me know. Murder by Decree and Hands of the Ripper are of course linked by the fact that they are both fictionalised stories concerning Jack the Ripper, using the mythology surrounding the murders to explore their own narratives and thematic concerns. Both movies feature a corrupt establishment, represented by Sir Charles in the first and Pritchard and Dysart in the second, depicting patriarchal societies where women are disposable victims, and the men who pretend to protect them do so for their own political or scientific ends. Ultimately, both movies ask the question whether the real monsters are the killers that they depict, or the society that has created them. And that's something that I will leave down to you to decide. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have any thoughts or comments on any of the films we've discussed in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com. And don't forget, you can also follow the show on Instagram at thehorrordouble. And I have to say, I am rather excited for next week as we are beginning our Christmas season with an episode that explores the origins of the British tradition of Christmas ghost stories and 2 movies inspired by the writing of M.R. James. First, we go back to 1968 and Whistle and I'll Come to You, directed by Jonathan Miller and starring Michael Hordern. And then we follow this with Night of the Demon from 1957 and director Jacques Tourneur, starring Dana Andrews, Peggy Cummings, Niall McGuinness and Athene Saylor. And yes, I know that pairing probably doesn't feel particularly Christmassy, but trust me, it really is. So if you want to watch along, as of the time of recording, you can currently see multiple versions of Whistle and I'll Come to You available on YouTube, and it's also available if you're in the US on Shudder. And Night of the Demon, which was originally released in the US as Curse of the Demon, is available for rent from Google Play, Apple TV, Sky Store, and Amazon Prime. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.